Hello, everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Future, Opportunities and Challenges in Cell and Gene Therapy for Rare Diseases. It's a Pharma Forum webinar brought to you by IPG Health. My name is Eloise McLennan. I am Pharma Forum's Deep Dive Editor, and I will be your moderator for today. Now, rare disease treatment poses a distinct challenge for physicians, patients, caregivers, and pharma companies, from limited treatment options to high costs to difficult clinical trial development. And cell and gene therapy offers a unique opportunity to address these challenges by treating disease at their genetic or cellular roots. However, as promising as these therapies are, every new development comes with its own unique set of hurdles. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. But before we dive in, I have a few housekeeping notes. Now, you can submit questions to us at any time using the Q&A box just below your video screen. We'll try and get through as many of those during the live sessions. But if we do run out of time, please feel free to continue the conversation over on LinkedIn, where our fantastic Pharma Forum web team will be live posting throughout the session. Also, this session will be being recorded and will be available to view on demand after the event. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our expert panel for today. Let's see all of your fabulous faces. We have Dr. Kristian Johnson, who is Global Medical Lead, Cell and Gene Therapies for Ophthalmology and Rare Diseases at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. We have Imre Varju, who is SVP Director of Learning Strategy at YuzuYello, which is an IPG Health company. Lynda Chang, who is Medical Strategy Director at HealthVizion, which is an IPG Health company. And Jane Blyth, who is Senior Medical Strategy Director at HealthVizion, which is also an IPG Health company. So welcome, everybody. Let's get started. Now, it's best to start off by setting the scene and setting the stage for today's discussion. So let's begin with the fundamentals. So Kristian, could you walk us through what CGT is and what it has the potential to provide for patients?
Thank you, Eloise. It'll be my pleasure. So cell and gene therapies really represent a fundamentally different approach to how we treat patients. Now, they allow us to treat diseases at really the most fundamental biological level, rather than what we're very often relegated to doing, which is just managing the symptoms of a disease. Because CGTs can actually help us, and this is our aim, to correct or to modify the underlying causes of a disease, similar to repairing a faulty electrical system rather than just changing light bulbs that burn out one after the other. And unlike conventional treatments, especially for chronic conditions that require chronic treatments, our aim with CGTs is really the one-time limited intervention with a long-lasting effect. Now, gene therapy approaches, they may include gene augmentation, which is the introduction of a functional copy of a gene to compensate for faulty copies, or to introduce genes that actually might encode for a therapeutic protein. We see this, for example, in the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy. We also have gene editing. So with technologies like CRISPR-Cas9, we can actually very precisely modify specific DNA sequences. We can do this to either correct spelling errors in the genetic code that can cause disease, but we can also use this to, for example, modify albumin sequences to encode for therapeutic proteins. Now, arguably, and I must admit my experience here is limited, we can also introduce RNA therapies in the gene therapy field, which would actually not alter the genome itself, but by targeting, for example, messenger RNA with antisense oligonucleotides or small inhibiting RNAs, we can modify the gene expression. Now, when we look at cell therapy approaches, we have ex vivo modified cells, so cells that have been removed from our patient, then genetically modified, and then transplanted back into the patient, we can either genetically enhance them or reintroduce them with improved function. So we see this, for example, in CAR T therapy for certain types of cancer. And we have the block of cell replacement therapy, where we transplant healthy cells that aim to restore functions in tissues where specific cell types have been lost or damaged. And so putting all this together, cell and gene therapies really have a tremendous transformative potential, including but not limited to providing more than just symptom management for chronic diseases. We can potentially attain disease modification and perhaps even more. This gives us hope for conditions that were previously seen as untreatable, especially but not limited to rare genetic disorders. And hopefully this will, in the near future, fundamentally shift our treatment paradigms from chronic treatment, chronic medication, to something that is, if not a cure, then as close to a cure as we can reasonably hope for. Now, while all of this is promising, there do remain challenges in manufacturing, because manufacturing of cell and gene therapies is, let's not beat about the bush, it's really, really complex. The delivery to the target tissues, there are also challenges concerning immune response, the durability of effect, which, quite frankly, since these are new therapies, we do not know very well what treatment effects will look like 1 decade, 2 decades, 5 decades after treatment. And last but certainly not least, the elephant in the room, which is accessibility due to cost.
So just taking us back just very quickly, why is CGT so uniquely suited to rare disease? We talked about the fact that you can get to the underlying causes and, as you say, edit. Why does that particularly apply to rare disease?
Now, obviously, rare diseases are not one monolith, but among the rare diseases, we find many that means approximately, let's say, 4 out of 5 rare diseases, they do have genetic origins. So they are caused quite often also even by mutations in a single gene. And so this predisposes them. I mean, it's basically asking for a treatment that would aim to correct this single mutation, this single mistake. And this is where we come in, because this is where we hope to address these underlying changes, these underlying defects, which will allow us to do more than merely managing the symptoms. And this is also where we see our rationale for hoping for disease modification, or even, and I don't like to use the cure word for several reasons, but I hope that we can achieve something that is as reasonably close to a cure as we can expect with our methods that are available today. Now, this also means that we aim to address conditions that were previously just simply deemed untreatable. There are more than 7,000 known rare diseases, and I don't think it's hyperbole to say that more are added to this group every week, every month, every year. And conventional drug development for these conditions has historically been limited because individually these populations can be quite small. CGTs can address disease mechanisms, especially in diseases caused by single genetic mutations where traditional pharmaceuticals cannot effectively engage the target. And so simply because those targets are seen as undruggable, but certainly quite open and achievable to treat those through genetic approaches by, again, replacing or fixing the defect gene. Or in the case of cell therapies, to supplement the tissues or the cells that are mostly affected with healthy ones that do not have this genetic mutation that is disease causing. And once more, the treatment paradigm that we're looking at is also very supportive here, because we are not looking at chronic treatment. We want to achieve a one-time treatment that effectively will take away the burden that people who live with these rare conditions are challenged with in every day and every life, by preventing these irreversible damage that usually occurs as the conditions progress. And so I do believe that with cell and gene therapies, we can actually simultaneously address multiple manifestations of multiple diseases where conventional therapies would otherwise be needed to combine, which by itself, again, brings several challenges that we've also seen in more common conditions where polypharmacy is actually a major burden, and something that we still haven't figured out how to manage it very well.
You mentioned challenges there. I think that's a really important thing to touch upon as one of the big parts of today's discussion, because with every opportunity, we wish it didn't have challenges, but often they do. So while you've provided a really good overview of what the opportunities are, I think it's time we dive a little bit into the challenges. And one of the biggest hurdles in bringing CGTs to patients is clinical trial recruitment. Can you share your insights into why it's particularly difficult to recruit in CGT trials?
Now, some of the challenges that we encounter are the challenges that we also see with more conventional therapies, that are the challenges associated with developing treatment for rare diseases, while others are quite fairly unique to cell and gene therapies. Now, I would say we can probably divide up those into three big groups. So firstly, are challenges related to clinical trial recruitment and clinical trial design. These overlap slightly with challenges that come from statistical methodology or regulatory hurdles, simply because we are actually dealing with small patient populations. And then there's also the challenge of finding appropriate outcome measures to really reflect what would be considered a positive outcome in rare conditions. Now, elaborating slightly on this, the trial recruitment and design challenges are simply due to the fact that, of course, the gold standard still is comparing either against a standard of care, which often doesn't exist in rare diseases. So you are forced to compare with placebo or sham treatment, which quite understandably, patients, their caregivers, their families may be reluctant to engage in, simply because the communities are very open, very, very eager to support research, but still being faced with the chance of receiving no treatment at all versus receiving the true treatment, it's still something that would make me step back and think, because there is a certain risk, because while this trial is running, I won't be able to receive any other treatment or any other trial treatment if I happen to be on placebo. So this is definitely something that is affecting, that constitutes a barrier. Now, it's not an insurmountable, but it is a certain barrier. What we've also seen and what we've also heard is that, especially in dose-finding studies where you slowly escalate, patients and caregivers and their families may also be reluctant to enroll here, simply because there is a certain risk, similar to what we've seen with placebo-controlled trials, that they may be assigned to a lower dose that may, in the end, turn out to be not efficacious. And actually, the complexity here is even bigger, because once you have been enrolled at a lower dose, even if it doesn't turn out to be efficacious, you will have undergone, for example, AAV gene therapy, which may leave you unsuitable for future trials that use similar constructs or delivery vehicles. And so what we also see is, and this feeds into the next topic, this statistical and regulatory hurdles, is that we often have very innovative trial designs, adaptive trials, crossover trials, which are very, very, very necessary, but they are more difficult to understand, and they are quite complex, which again adds an additional level of complexity when gathering consent to participation in such a trial. Now, I'm going to try and cut this short. I mean, the statistical and regulatory hurdles, as well as the outcome measure complexities, we always deal with very limited patient numbers. This is a fundamental challenge if we want to show statistically robust signs for efficacy. Now, there is a way to supplement this by going through natural history databases, but those are often incomplete, or in the case of very rare or ultra rare conditions, we just do not have them, which again makes it difficult to establish an appropriate baseline. And then, of course, these diseases, while rare, are not a monolith. They can be very heterogeneous, which also means that the variability of outcomes can be, I don't want to say all over the place, but it is very, very, very difficult sometimes to actually interpret those results properly. And on the other hand, we have regulatory agencies who are very, very, very helpful most of the time when it comes to making allowances for orphan diseases or for orphan medications, but they still require a substantial level of evidence for efficacy, which we cannot always overcome because of these limitations. That said, there are some ways around this. There are great things going on in the US with accelerated approval, with biomarker-based endpoints, which I'm super optimistic about, which I think will hopefully change the way that we develop such treatments in the near and midterm future. But we still will have to balance such surrogate biomarker-based endpoints with clinically meaningful outcomes that are actually based on efficacy and on everyday life and everyday function. And but it is an exciting time to be in the rare disease space. It really is.
Lovely. And Jane, I'd love to bring in you here to get your thoughts. What are some of the more specific factors that can complicate trial outcomes in CNG therapy?
Yeah, thanks, Eloise. To build on what Kristian said, I think some of the specific challenges in designing effective clinical studies, we've already touched on them a little bit. That lack of robust and comprehensive natural history data that you just don't have in the rare disease space. The heterogeneous nature of the presentation. But I would also add to that low diagnosis rates and simply actually the access to the patients because their disease has not been recognized. We know that late or delayed diagnosis and misdiagnosis is common in the rare disease space. And the final thing I'd add, and again, we touched on this a little, but there is sometimes ambiguity in the interpretation of outcomes and ambiguity in what is truly a meaningful change. And I would layer that on top of some of what Kristian has said.
Fantastic. And beyond clinical trials, patient support is also critical in cell and gene therapy. So Imre, can you speak on patient support programs and how maybe they differ from traditional therapies?
Absolutely, Eloise. That is a great question. And then as Kristian kind of gave us a great outline about how big of a paradigm shift CGTs, cell gene-directed therapies, mean in the space of rare disease. If you translate that to what kind of support these patients, caregivers, and even healthcare professionals need, it's a very different art. And most of the time in rare disease spaces, we're used to lifelong treatments, chronic medications, either once-a-day pills or infusions that are recurring over time and over time. as Kristian said, this is a finite therapy. Most of these therapies are finite. Sometimes it's even one time, but that one time, getting to that therapeutic situation, until that actually occurs, is a big hurdle for patients. It means eligibility tests to actually even be referred to this treatment. It means coordination between two different providers, because one's the referrer, the other one is at the treatment center. It means going through tests. It means going through, when it comes to CAR T therapy, for instance, where we, chemically re-engineer the antigens based on the top of the white blood cells to then later on reintroduce them to attack cancer cells. In that process, you need to harvest the white blood cells first. Then there's a bridging treatment. Then there's reintroduction, like the reintroduction of those modified white blood cells into the bloodstream in order for them to exert their therapeutic effects. Those are very distinct steps and very different from the traditional rare disease what the rare disease space has seen so far. So accordingly, what we see at YuzuYello, we're a patient support specialized agency, and we work across 30 plus different programs. What we see here is that even manufacturers who have really mature portfolio programs for rare diseases, even the way they think about patient support for CAR T and other CGTs is absolutely different. Those support programs will become a different brand, become very separate from these traditional programs, because just the level of coordination that needs to be provided to the HCPs as well as the patients is absolutely different. So there's certainly pharma companies are realizing that this is a distinct challenge, and they are involving innovative approaches in how to tackle this new paradigm shift.
We've talked a little bit about opportunities and challenges. There's one big thing that I think we do need to touch upon, and that's how CGT is perceived. So there are a lot of misconceptions and a lot of fear-mongering that goes on around CGT. So Lynda, can you talk us through some of the most common misconceptions?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest misconception comes around the fact that there is actually very limited experience with cell and gene therapies. We know that CAR T therapies have been around for a little while now, but that not everybody is able to get a CAR T therapy. So you're looking at a subpopulation of a subpopulation almost. So there is a fear of these treatments. When we're particularly talking about genetic therapies. The people are starting to think, you're messing around with my DNA, you're changing my DNA. Are you changing who I fundamentally am? So there's a lot of questions in and around that need to be answered and discussed. There is that lack of safety and efficacy data at the moment, particularly long-term. We have some short-term data now, but long-term, we still don't know how long the treatment is actually going to last for. Kristian has mentioned at the moment, it's a one shot, you've got one go and then that's it. We're still looking at, the possibility of a second treatment. But it's still so new that we really aren't aware and we don't know what's going to be happening there. And then there's this idea, and Kristian again sort of alluded to the fact that we don't want to use the word cure. When we're talking about cell and gene therapy, we're talking about fixing genes or fixing the cells. A lot of people will start thinking, well, does that mean my disease will be cured? And we can't say that because we don't know. Is the fundamental answer. So we very much look at, and when we're looking at sort of clinical trial development and when we're talking about communicating, we are very much talking about disease modification or changing the course of the disease. The idea is that we're hoping to slow down that disease progression and hopefully eventually that would lead to, significant benefits for those patients. So I think those are probably the most common misconceptions that, that I've certainly seen and discussed with KOLs and with some patients as well. I don't know.
And Jane, do you have anything you want to add there? I'd particularly like to hear about how we can help to manage those expectations that patients have coming in, all those misconceptions, how we address those. Jane, you're on mute. Bear with me one moment.
I'm sorry. I completely agree with Lynda. There is a need to recognize that we don't have enough even short and long-term robust data to know truly what enduring and lasting effects even effective therapies have, and we have to manage that. And to go back to your question, Eloise, I think it's about the dialogue and conversations that we have around when we're building the studies, when we're designing the studies, when we're communicating the data, and to the point Imre made earlier, when we're supporting the patients and their families through it. I think it just has to be a realistic discussion, because the nature of CGT has the potential to be transformative. I think that can be fixed on, forgetting that there's still exploratory treatments that we're still unpacking the full and longer term impact of.
It's interesting to hear you talk about education there, because I think that's such a big key to overcoming misconception. But there's another element beyond that, which is trust. And building trust takes time, it takes dedication. So Lynda, I want to ask you, what are the most effective ways to establish that sense of trust with patients, with caregivers, and with regulators as well?
I think the fundamental point is we need to be transparent, and, you know, be open with physicians, with payers, with patients, and, you know, and with that comes this idea that we have to be able to educate people well, and, you know, let them understand, to, you know, teach them what cell and gene therapies are, what the differences are, you know, what our hopeful expectations are, but, you know, what the reality may well be, and the fact that the clinical trial outcomes may be different to perhaps what they think their outcomes should be. Because those measures are often very, very different. You know, some patients will just want to be able to get out of their seat, walk to the kitchen, get a glass of water and come back. But you can't say that in a clinical trial, because you couldn't get a patient to do that every time they came in for an observation. So I think the provision of education is really important, and it has to be almost above brand. There's this idea of, you know, what is cell and gene therapy? We have, like Kristian said, we've got 7,000 rare diseases out there. They all have their own unique things, but if we want to give them a cell and gene therapy, the fundamentals of what that isn't really going to change that much. You know, those educational points that we need to make aren't going to change that much. So I think that is probably the first step of understanding what CGT therapies are, and then understanding, you know, what a clinical trial is. If physicians will know, obviously, but patients don't necessarily know. They don't know what a phase 1 trial is or a phase 2, and they don't know what we're looking for at each of these. They just think, I'm getting a treatment. Is it going to work or not? So, you know, there needs to be that sort of educational point. And I think that will also fit in with the, this managing of expectations. It's like, this is what we're looking at this point in this clinical trial. So I think that's probably the fundamentals. I would say, though, particularly in the rare disease space, that there are very, very few treatments for these patients. So there's a lot of hope attached to any treatment that comes out, be it an advanced therapy or standard pharmacological therapy. And, you know, and I think any of those discussions that we do have, you need to be aware of that vulnerability of these patients. You know, they are looking for a lot of hope. And, you know, that hope has to be tempered with the fact that we still don't know. So I think that's sort of what I wanted to sort of say about that.
I think that's a really important point to end on, the idea of hope. But to understand where that hope is and what patients are expecting, there also needs to be some sort of patient involvement. And from what I understand with cell and gene therapy, it needs to be quite early on in the process. So Jane, could you talk us through the idea of early patient involvement in terms of CGT?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to what we were talking about with respect to clinical trial design. Increasingly, you need the patient voice in from the very beginning, even at the protocol design stage. And when I've spoken at rare disease conferences, I've seen some great presentations recently from patient groups who've had representatives speaking to the regulatory authorities, speaking to the pharmaceutical companies, speaking to the trial sponsors, and ensuring that their perception of what they need is reflected. And there is two aspects to that. And one of them is absolutely that the endpoints and design is going to be more meaningful for the group who is ultimately there to serve. But the second piece ties in with what Lynda was saying, and I think it's to do with its education and its trust. Going back to the original question, Eloise, if you have a stake and feel your voice is heard, then the trust will build from there. And that becomes important, looping back to the managing expectations of what's possible, what's not possible, what you can hope for, but what you should not be misled about in any way. I guess the other thing I would add is to do with, I think, going back to the trust question, Eloise, the role that pharma companies can play. They have such an important role here, and it's not just as the owners and scientific developers of the product. I think they're in a really great position to be able to facilitate discussion and education in a way that's so, it's always important, but it's particularly important in rare diseases. And I've worked on educational programs, an award-winning educational program actually, and we really work to bring the thought leaders together and encourage peer-to-peer exchange. And it's because the rarity of the disease can often mean that the clinical experience is limited. Even for thought leader physicians, every patient story becomes a really important educational point. And I think the role that pharma companies can play in their commitment to the therapy areas and those rare disease communities and providing and facilitating education is incredibly important.
I just want to bring Kristian back into the discussion here, because as one of those working for one of those pharmaceutical companies, how do you see peer-to-peer exchanges among experts playing a role, and how can pharma's long-term commitment to rare disease help to build that trust?
I mean, I don't want to sound flippant, but it's really, really, really important that we meet all of the stakeholders where they are. Rare disease patients, their families, their caregivers, they've often faced years or decades even of a diagnostic odyssey, misdiagnoses, disappointments, and this may not even stop once they've finally found their diagnosis, even if they are on a treatment. Unfortunately, we as pharma haven't always been great interacting with the communities. There are stories, there's history of pharma partners swooping in with a rare disease community, getting all involved and all engaged, and then at the first sign of the product or the asset not working out, just quietly withdrawing. And we need to be better about this. We need to be transparent. It's been said before, and I do believe the community is resilient enough to understand that not all drugs that are in development will actually make it to launch. So this is not something where we need to be ashamed or where we need to hide. It's all about how we engage and really creating also an environment where concerns can be voiced openly without judging people as being bossy or difficult or not a team player. And in the end, and again, this is something super simple. Again, we need to demonstrate genuine empathy and see this as more than just a transactional interaction when we involve ourselves with the community. And this will actually help us create those meaningful connections and hopefully also build the foundation, build a fundament for connections with other communities, or if we are the lucky ones that actually do manage to bring an asset to the patient for everyday treatment, also the basis for a fruitful and trustful relationship.
And Imre, I want to bring you back in as well, because looking at those trusting relationships and talking about the idea of commitment beyond the success of your drug. Patient support programs have been a huge part of making those patients feel connected and supported, but HCPs they can be sometimes hesitant or unaware of PCPs or PSPs. So how can data on patient outcomes help to shift those perceptions? How can we help to drive this awareness and bring more people on board?
That's an excellent question, Eloise. And we do have to look at patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals, at the same time when it comes to, trust in pharma and trust it through patient support programs. I want to argue that in the rare disease space, patient support programs are not a nice to have, so to say, or a value add for any company. They're absolutely table stakes. And that's what we see across the different companies working who invest very heavily in rare disease, that their support programs are very, very comprehensive. There's also this kind of unexpected benefit, so to say, of not having large patient populations, that you can actually assign more one-to-one connections with these patients, and more, whether they are nurse navigators or call center people, who can actually keep in touch with the patient across the entirety of the patient journey. For patient populations where for chronic diseases where the patient populations are much higher in quantity, that is very, very hard to do, and these kind of efforts are less scalable. But in the rare disease space, this is a unique opportunity, and companies are realizing that. And most of the success stories that we see actually come from that very close one-to-one connection. So that kind of connecting person, or that contact person, becomes kind of the face of the company, of the manufacturer for these patients, and it's a great way to build trust and also actually provide ongoing value for the patient. So I would argue that these support programs are critical for building trust with the patients. And you mentioned the healthcare professional side of the story, which is just as important, because most of the time, in order for enrollment to happen into these patient support programs, the healthcare professional is also needed, whether they're needed for the enrollment process or they're the ones who actually bring the patient support program to the patient's attention. In both cases, they are critical gatekeepers to patient awareness and patient enrollment into these programs. Now, that is a very, very challenging kind of task to solve, because understandably, the healthcare professionals feel ownership over the patient's journey, right? They don't necessarily want a lot of people and a lot of different parties involved in their interactions post-prescription. The one way to kind of build that trust, and what we see more and more, is what you were alluding to, actually showcasing to healthcare professionals data, the value of the program, whether that's qualitative outcomes and feedback from the patients who are participating in these programs, or actual adherence data and hard percentages on how these programs can help your patients better stay on track with their medication and potentially reach better outcomes. In the end, those hard data actually we see that those are effective in changing these healthcare professional perceptions. So both arms are very, very important when we look at how quick you can build trust through patient support programs.
Fantastic. Now, before we head on to our last question before the audience Q&A section, I do just want to remind everybody watching, if you do have a question for any of our panelists, please do start getting those in. We will be getting to that in about 5 minutes, so please do get your questions into us. Now, we talked about trust, we talked about opportunities, about challenges and perceptions. Now, how do we communicate these? Because obviously communication is a huge piece of the puzzle. You can have the best systems in the world, if you can't effectively communicate that to the other person, it doesn't matter. So Lynda, I'd like to get your perspective on this. What are some of the key principles for effective communications with rare disease communities particularly?
I think the important thing to realize is that, again, the rare disease community is a very unique place in that the patients themselves and the patients' caregivers themselves are almost the experts in their own diseases. And so in terms of disease state education, that side of things, it's perhaps a little bit less necessary. And I think the focus probably will need to be more on the technology that we're hoping to provide to them that, could improve their outcomes. And I think there are number of key topics that you need to have, have both HCPs and patients, understand. And I think this comes back down to this, this transparency and this managing expectations piece, in that we need physicians and patients to realize that the treatment success can very much depend on the stage of that patient's disease. We're very much used to clinical trials, standard clinical trials. You start off in the very, very sick population and then move through as you're starting to see that success to earlier lines of therapy. But that may not necessarily be the case for rare diseases, because you are more likely to see a benefit earlier in that disease course. By the time a patient might come to a clinical trial, they may already be too ill for anybody to be able to really do anything. And then it's almost managing symptoms. So, I think there's a big discussion around that. I think there is that diagnosis piece, get to them earlier, and then, and then understand who might be eligible for that clinical trial. Then I think the next thing is then people need to understand that what you've had previously can affect what you may have in the future. So if you've had a particular cell and gene therapy, it means that you may not necessarily be eligible for a different kind of cell and gene therapy. So there's a lot of those discussions, and there's a lot of questions around that. We just don't know the answer to that yet. And then, how long that treatment will last. We're hoping it's a long-term treatment. We just don't know yet. So, there's that managing of that expectation. And I think really just sort of get patients involved in that clinical trial development. They understand what their challenges are, their day-to-day challenges, and they may be able to feed into some of those outcomes to sort of say, well, these are the things that we care about. And sometimes they're very different to what an HCP would care about and what they're trying to treat. So, bringing them all together, I think that's quite a useful thing to do. And then, just be mindful that in rare diseases, there is a big unmet need. So, the community, the impact on the community of a success or a failure is that much bigger than perhaps a traditional pharmacological clinical trial.
And Imre, coming to you with your experience with patient education that we've been speaking about earlier, how can we ensure that education isn't just a one and done, one-time effort? Because it's sort of the opposite of what we've been talking about with cell and gene therapy, that we want this to be a one-time treatment without the pills in between. No, with education, we want it to be a many times consistent project rather than a one and done. So how can we ensure that's an ongoing process sort of throughout the patient's journey, and not just here you are at the beginning, here's all of your information, good luck?
It is a critical question, and because I believe that a lot of times, especially in the rare disease space, it's not even about not having enough information. Sometimes, these patients, as we said, as Lynda just said, they're experts in their condition. They know how to seek out medical information. Sometimes they may even know about clinical trials, even if they don't get into the details of which phase we're talking. They definitely recognize manufacturer names and the companies and their equity in the space much more than kind of the rest of the patient population, so to say, generally speaking. So sometimes it's not about how much information there is, but how we sequence that information is the digestibility of the information that is oftentimes lacking. I was just looking up an outline of what CAR T therapies, one of the CGT therapies are. And this website was actually published by one of the major treatment centers here in the greater New York City area. And it's an extremely comprehensive guide. You will understand everything from soup to nuts to how these cells are manufactured, all over to like what we know about clinical studies. But it takes 36 minutes for ChatGPT to read through this single page, as I learned. And it's also written at 10 plus grader reading level. And the general population in the US reads at around the 7th grade. And if you talk about Medicare, Medicaid populations, it's even lower than that. And you can think of like most European reading levels as falling into, on average, into that same category. So there's definitely a discrepancy in how complex this information is versus what generally patients are, versus what is generally easy to digest for patients, and also how it's presented. Because as you said, like a one-time education, this is impossible to retain. So rather than kind of providing patients with an overflowing amount of information at one time, why don't we chapterize that information? And how do we do that? It has to be a collaboration between the treatment center, the provider, the pharmaceutical company, and everyone will have their place. And at the right moment of the journey, they will need to align on who educates on what and what is the right amount and the right piece of information to give to the patient, right? If we're talking to a patient who's been diagnosed, as Lynda said, 10 years ago, probably disease education is not the right thing to start at the time of prescription, right? It's much more about what you can expect from the treatment. But even there's two levels. It's one is how does the treatment work? Because patients will want to understand what the treatment does to their body. The second is what is the actual process of me getting on this medication, getting to a treatment center? How do I, figure out transportation? How do I figure out lodging? Because sometimes these patients have to stay nearby the treatment center for a couple of weeks and actually have to find lodging for themselves. So how do I sequencing out the right amount of information and the right piece of information across the entire journey has to be this sort of collaboration between these entities.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the level of reading, because the thing that pops the most into my head is the acronyms, the number of acronyms that exist within healthcare, which seem to be the same acronym for different things across the sector. So it's a really interesting idea to look at who you're speaking to and what level you need to be speaking to, the level of explanation that needs to come in as well. Now we're entering into our Q&A section. I'd like to start things off. Please, if you do have a question for any of our panelists, do get them into us. We spoke a little bit earlier about misinformation, and it can be a huge challenge for emerging therapies. So I would like to know if you could correct one misconception about CGT, whether it's from patients, from HCPs, or from the industry, what would it be and why? Who wants to take that first? I will start picking on people. Lynda, you're looking thoughtful.
There are so many. It's so hard to sort of capture just one. I think it's understanding what the drug or what the therapy can do for you. I think for me, that's really, really important. And we're not just for the patient, but also for the doctor, because I think that idea of a cure is across the board. We've got some really highly educated people. We've got people who are perhaps less educated as well. And getting everybody to understand that would be a massive challenge, but a massive kudos to the people who could actually do that. Before we I pass on to somebody else, I just wanted to sort of quickly mention an addition to something that Imre was saying, where we talk about the patient communication. And I think we forget that also the HCP education is, how does the HCP give that medication? How does the HCP get that patient into a center that can provide that particular therapy? And I think, that's obviously another education point. And I think that comes as part of that building the community across the board. And I'm going to allow somebody else to speak now.
All right. This is a super, super important point that you brought up, Lynda. Really, the question, what can this therapy achieve in the good bit as well as in the bad bits? And I do believe decades of Hollywood movies have at the same time completely overblown the expectations of the good gene therapy can achieve, and at the same time build up all kinds of horror scenarios that are just plain not realistic. And I think in the end, what is important is even if it may be a functional cure, which we still have to show for the individual conditions, that still doesn't mean that we can lay off or be negligent about diagnosis, about quick accessibility to treatment, and so on and so forth, because what has been lost in function will unfortunately stay lost in neuromuscular diseases, but really across the board. And just the availability of a cell therapy or a gene therapy doesn't mean we do not need screening efforts and well-educated general practitioners, as well as second or third tier specialists.
Fantastic. I'm going to cut that question short because we've had a question come in, which is, where do you see pharmacy in the CGT space in the future, and what challenges could be faced and how could these be overcome? Who would like to take that one?
I would make a comment on that from a simply practical perspective. In the nature, I think it depends on the nature of the treatment, and this goes back a little bit to the what's the one thing we'd correct. Not all treatments are the same. How they are given and what is required of them and where they need to be given and by whom and how often is going to vary. But there's going to need to be some expectation setting around what the patients be required of the patients. And Imre touched on this on the simple practical level of they need to be near a specialist centre for the treatment. They need to understand that that's what they'll need to do. And Kristian also touched on the need for monitoring, the need for screening, the need for management, the need for adverse event monitoring. None of that goes away just because it's a CGT therapy. None of that goes away. So the commitment to understand the journey, not just the diagnostic journey, which has been a lot of my focus, but the journey going forward. So the pharmacy piece, to me, it's where they fit is going to just be a really clear conversation to include them. And they are a stakeholder in it. If they play a role in the centres where the treatment are being administered, they need to understand what that role is and what's going to be required of them. So it goes back to the making sure that the expectations have been managed across all stakeholders. Once the therapy is initiated, you are not done. There is commitment on all sides.
Yeah. No, this is super important point, Jane, because especially in the rare disease space, I see the treatment very much in the hand of centers of excellence. And of course, the pharmacies are an absolutely integral part of these centers of excellence. Now, what this exactly looks like, unfortunately, will depend on the sort of healthcare system you are working in. And I do believe we see substantial differences between the UK, within mainland Europe, as well as the US, and also other regions or countries. But again, the center of excellence is really the treatment unit, and the pharmacy cannot be outside of this.
Very well put. We've had another question come in, which is, AI and big data are playing an increasing role in drug development. How do you see these technologies impacting CGT? Imre, I can see you smiling.
Yeah,
And you spoke about data earlier, so I'm going to throw that over to you.
Great. No, that's an excellent question. I'm very glad that someone asked this, because I can talk from the patient support side. So once patients are actually on treatment, what are the opportunities of using AI in that sense? And this is really an exciting time because we are literally starting to understand this as we speak. Right? Like at IPG Health, we're thinking about what are the right ways to deploy our newest AI capabilities for our clients. And there are a couple of things that you can think about when it comes to the post-Rx journey once the patient is on prescription. Right? One is it's really trying to figure out, if you're working across many different brands, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have multiple brands in a portfolio, let's say, of support programs, you can take a look at the totality of the data that you have, all the research about these patients, all the different pieces of data that you've collected over the years, and basically feed it into a natural language processing algorithm through AI. And what it will give you is a whole new layer and a whole new set of insights from the data that you already think you know. Because what natural language processing achieves is it really goes beyond just the patient verbatim. It really goes beyond what the patient is telling us and actually able to extract feelings, behavioral biases that may be holding the patient populations back from moving forward in the journey. And also gives us strategies on how to overcome those barriers. That is critical when we plan a patient support program. And what this, kind of high throughput data processing can achieve is that you can actually set up different patient personas across all your different brands and all the different medications and the different therapeutic categories. And we may be able to identify certain archetypes across these different brands and saying, like, this is kind of the type of patient who would need this type of support, XYZ, across their treatment journey versus this other type of patient who might need a very different set of patient support offerings in order to ensure adherence and ensure that they have a higher probability of therapeutic success. Right. So really, this will lead us to the next generation of custom tailoring patient support to the individual needs. So when we say that, this is really the time when this can happen. And one of the other things, and then I'll let someone else speak to this, is also traditionally what we've been seeing is pharma companies invest a lot, and definitely a lot, and understandably, in developing drugs. And then once those drugs are developed, marketing them in a way that that we can make sure that the patients who really need those medications will actually have a productive conversation with their healthcare professionals on getting on treatment. But traditionally, what we see is there's a divide when it comes to how do we support patients in the post-Rx space. There's a little bit of less resources in there, and the lack of relative investment. And AI I would argue, will be able to equalize this situation a little bit, because for a little bit less of investment, you can get more profound data and more precise data on what is really meaningful for your patients in the post-Rx space.
And before we wrap up our session today, I do want to ask one more. We've had one more question come in that I think is quite an important one, given the subject we're talking about. And it says that transformational treatment is what we all wish to achieve. How can this be achieved in financially challenged organizations from a research perspective, given the complexity described? It's the big elephant in the room. We all know that health organizations are strapped for cash. We want to be able to provide these treatments for patients. So how can we overcome those challenges?
I'm happy to make a comment from the health medcoms perspective, which is that I think we have to create the win-win. So we have to find the specificity and the population where the benefit is absolutely commensurate with the investment involved. But I also think there has to be a wider commitment from society to leave no rare disease behind and provide the appropriate funding and infrastructure to do that. So I think there is a balance. I think from the trial design perspective, it's about reaching the people who you truly working out who that population, if it's a subpopulation of a subpopulation, as Lynda spoke about earlier, it's doing that. But I think there has to be a broader commitment as well in terms of making sure that no one is left behind. And there's a really interesting Rare 2030 initiative in Europe where they've done some horizon scanning to basically consult with patients, caregivers, healthcare providers around rare diseases. And there's a commitment there to leave no patient behind. And it's only the start, trying to find the patients, and then it's about finding the therapies. But I think it's being smart whilst having the wider ambition in society. I think that's what I would say. I don't know if any of the other panel want to comment.
I think being smart is a is a super great idea, and to me this also means not to just look at individual conditions or individual assets, but look at what they have in common. Ideally, you'll have a platform for lysosomal storage disorders or from neuromuscular conditions where you can actually leverage the combined infrastructure that is already out there, where you are using the synergies across different communities, and where and this is leaving gene therapies a little bit behind and looking at cell therapies, where you also look at potentially at what is going on in a specific cell type that may be affected, or specific tissues that may be affected. For example, in inherited retinal disease, there are gene therapies out there, but they only tackle one mutation or the other mutation, while photoreceptor or RPE based cell therapies may actually tackle literally hundreds of different conditions with one treatment. Now, what we need here is to also see what can be done to be more flexible in the regulatory space, because right now one condition is one indication. So I would be excited to see more options towards basket type of treatments for inherited retinal diseases that affect photoreceptors, for example. And yeah, this is really where I want to see things move on in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of your questions today. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions. But before we do wrap up, I would like to hear one final thought from each of you. One quick sentence of what excites you about the future of CGT in rare disease. And I'm going to start with Imre, because I haven't heard from you for a while. Imre, what excites you about the future of CGT?
To me, because I'm biased towards how we support patients across their therapeutic journey, it's really the next level of connections that we can make with patients who are going through this very complicated process of cell gene therapy.
Jane?
I think mine ties in with something Kristian said, and it's about us getting better and smarter at reaching more and more patients and using the resources and science we have more cleverly, and bringing the regulators with us, and that kind of shift there that we may see.
Lynda?
I would say for me, it's the excitement of the new. It's the excitement of the potential that these therapies can, treat these very, very hard to treat diseases. And for me, I think that the potential that we can help these patients is massive for me.
And finally, Kristian.
I mean, I have been privileged over the past years to get more and more engaged and get to know different rare disease communities. And I'm absolutely blown away by how educated, how smart, and how resilient the people living with a variety of different conditions are. And if we can do our little part in moving things forward towards treating the untreatable, I think this is not just exciting, but it's also a reward unto itself.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. A huge thank you to all of our panelists and for you too as well for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry. There are some details on the screen now of people you can get in touch with to ask a few more questions. And this whole session will be available to view on demand. Thank you so much for joining us again today. Please join us again next time for the next Pharma Forum webinar. Goodbye.